The Learning Tree, Chapter 14. Newt arrived at the Kiner farm early the next Saturday morning. There was a note from Jake tacked to the barn door, saying he and his wife would be away until afternoon. Newt stuffed the note in his pocket, wishing now he'd gone to see Pete ride in the rodeo at Parsons'. He cleaned tack for the first hour, then swept the floor, and went out to the fields, hoeing weeds, until nearly 12 o'clock. Finally, tired from the half-day's work, he swung the hoe to his shoulder and looked about for shelter from the burning sun. There was a tree close by, but he found it too skimpy for shade, so he walked back to the barn, figuring to get a good hour's rest before Jake returned. He entered the barn, stood the hoe against the wall, and settled on a box. Then, changing his mind, he climbed the wooden ladder to the loft and stretched out in the hay. It took him several minutes to devour 2 sandwiches. Then he rolled over on his back and gazed idly at the ceiling until his eyelids got heavy. Before long he was fast asleep. More than 2 hours had passed when he sprang awake to a squeaking noise down on the floor beneath him. He scooted quietly to the edge of the loft and peeped below, fearing that Jake had discovered his absence. Then his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Jake. It was Booker Savage, and he was ripping the lock off the door to the room where Jake stored his applejack and peach brandy. Afraid of what Booker might do if he saw him, Newt just lay quiet and watched. The bottom hinge was loose now, and Booker wedged a crowbar under the top screws. With one powerful jerk, he wrenched the lock and hinges off, and they clattered to the floor. Then, hooking the crowbar in the back pocket of his overalls, he placed a gunny sack on the floor and slipped into the dark room. Within seconds, Newt saw him loading pint bottles in the sack. Booker stopped at the sound of Jake's angry voice coming from the barn door. "You ain't getting 1 penny more out of me, Silas. Now get out of here, you drunken bum, before I throw you out." Silas Newhall staggered in after him. "I ain't leaving here till you pay me what's coming to you, you goddamn old pinch penny." Jake's face screwed up in anger, and he reached to the wall for his bullwhip. "I'm warning you for the last time to get out," he hollered, threatening the reeling Silas with the heavy end of the whip. "You don't scare me, you old son of a bitch." Silas grabbed Newt's hoe as he yelled back, but before he could swing it, Jake stepped to one side and clouted him on the temple with the butt end of the whip. Silas fell unconscious to the floor. Jake had stumbled on the sack of bottles as he swung, and now, as he steadied himself, he saw the awesome figure of Booker Savage peering from the dark of the doorway. Bewildered, he paused a moment with his mouth open, and then he snapped the whip and struck. Booker flinched and raised the crowbar. Jake drew back again, but before he could swing, the crowbar smashed against his head. He went down without uttering a sound. With the first blow, the beast seemed to have been loosed in Booker, and he smashed the crowbar time and time again into Jake's bloody head. Finally, Booker stood over the 2 forms on the floor, looking about, breathing heavily. Silas moaned. Booker stooped, pulled out the whip from beneath Jake's arm, and beat the moan to a stillness. He dropped the whip by Silas's head and started away. And then he turned back, picked the crowbar up, and placed it in Silas's limp left hand. After that he lifted the sack of bottles, stepped warily through the door, and fled across the field. Newt hadn't moved during the swift, brutal assault, and when he did, it was in a maze of nightmarish thought. It was as if he'd had a bad dream, and not yet fully awake, believed he was still dreaming. He crawled to the back of the loft and pinned his eye to a crack in the wallboards, watching Booker make off into the nearby woods. Suddenly he knew he had to get out of there himself. He started for the ladder, then stopped and crouched, for Mary Kiner had appeared at the barn door. Catching sight of the forms lying in the shadows beyond the doorway, she stepped in further, an apprehensive look on her face. Then she threw up her hands and ran screaming toward the house. "Oh, my Lord! Oh, help! Help!" When she was gone, Newt clambered down the ladder, crept toward the door, glancing timorously at the 2 men sprawled like ragamuffins on the floor. He peeped out the door, then burst through it and loped over the furrowed earth toward home. He slowed down as he approached Logan's Grove. He was shaking now, so instead of going to the house, he cut across to the cowshed, staying there until the shaking stopped. Though fatigue was upon Newt like an opiate this night, he couldn't sleep. He had slipped off to bed at nightfall, dinnerless and faking an upset stomach. Jack Winger sensed more worry than ailment in his son's complaining, but he was wrong about the source. "That boy's heart sure must be heavy if he goes to bed without eating," he confided to Sarah, slapping a fly on his forehead. "Must be still thinking about that girl. Well, It was a pretty hard blow for him to take at his age, Sarah said, and then they dropped the subject. Twice during the night the harrowing scene ran through Newt's mind and flushed him into a fearful awakening. He lay in what seemed like never-ending darkness, wondering whether he should tell. By church time Sunday morning the news of Jake Kiner's death and Silas Newhall's arrest had swept across languid Cherokee Flats like a storm. Every minister in town sparked his sermon on the tragedy, but Reverend Lucius Broadnapp preached a half-hour overtime, ended finally by shouting, "The devil got in here yesterday afternoon and undone all the word of Jesus has been spreading among us for years. Bless the sorrowful widow of this poor man whose life blood lays cold this minute on the floor of his barn. Bless us all, dear Jesus. Amen." Later, an uneasy calm lay over the Winger household while Sarah and Prissy spread the Sunday table. Uncle Rob, heavy eyelids batting behind dark glasses, sat in the shadow of the chimney pipe. Pete stood at a window gazing into the distance, watching the slow turn of the weather vane atop the Kiner barn. Newt sat on the floor, his back propped against the sideboard, staring into space, and Jack leaned against the wall in the straight-backed chair, smoking his pipe. He was the first to break the silence. "Powerful sermon Broadnapp preached today, Rob." Rob's head lifted and his lids blinked even faster. "Yes, it was. Yes, it was."